Generally, by the point where Horus and the Emperor are fighting each other, the rest of the traitor forces are a series of crazed warbands roaming through the palace, killing whatever they can, and the loyalists are so broken down that they're not really any better. Hello, I am Arbitor Ian. I talk about Warhammer on the internet, and today I'm here to answer your questions about the Horus Heresy. The last two times I've been on IGN, I've answered your questions about 40k, but there's a new edition of the Horus Heresy out, and so this time we're going to delve into the legends of the Horus Heresy.
What now then?
We make ready for a war that may never end.
220 volt 50 Hz 3 WROHS says, explain like I'm 5. What is the Horus Heresy? The Horus Heresy is kind of the founding myth of Warhammer 40k. 10,000 years before the entire setting of Warhammer 40k, the Emperor arises on Terra, unites the planet, and then sets off into the galaxy with his 20 Space Marine legions. He unites the galaxy under the rule of the Imperium, and then a civil war happens. One of the Primarchs, Horus, the most trusted Primarch, is corrupted by chaos. 9 of his brother Primarchs side with him, and he leads a war on the Emperor. The war lasts a decade. It rages across the entire galaxy as worlds, armies, and legions of Space Marines all declare either for the Emperor or for Horus, and it culminates in the Siege of Terra, when Horus comes to Terra, breaks his way through the defenses, and eventually fights the Emperor in single combat. The Emperor wins, Horus is defeated, but the Emperor is mortally wounded, and whatever plans he eventually had for the Imperium lie ruined and in tatters. And the Imperium we see in 40k is the result of that. Nikoru Nikori asks, who's really to blame for the Horus Heresy? That is a question that has a number of different ways to answer it. So the Horus Heresy starts, in its simplest reading, when Horus is corrupted by a demon weapon, turns a load of brothers to his side, and fights against the Emperor. But we could go back further and say, well, the demon weapon is put there by a different Primarch, by Lorgar of the Word Bearers. Lorgar of the Word Bearers is raised on a planet that are extremely religious and kind of worship chaos. They don't really understand what it is. But when the Emperor turns up, Lorgar turns the whole planet into worshipping the Emperor, which the Emperor really doesn't like. The Emperor, after a while of Horus turning the planets he conquers for the Imperium into giant churches, the Emperor punishes Lorgar and tells him off and says that you've disappointed me because you're not meant to be worshipping anything, and that drives Lorgar even further into worshipping chaos. And it's Lorgar's legion that take that demon weapon and put Horus in a position to be possessed by it. So maybe it's Lorgar who's the first heretic. And then we could go further and say, well, all those Primarchs were probably intended to be raised in terror by the Emperor as loyal sons, and in fact the problem is they were scattered all over the galaxy and ended up being raised on planets like Lorgar's. And the person who did that is a perpetual called Urda, who scattered the Primarchs into the warp. So maybe she's to blame for the Horus Heresy. Or we could go even further and say none of this would have happened if the Emperor didn't try and unite the galaxy really quickly and steal a load of power from chaos in order to do it. So maybe the Emperor caused the Horus Heresy. Much like in the real world, events of this scale are caused by a massive number of factors, all interacting in the worst way possible. Epicantha says, why was Horus made Warmaster in the first place, even though he was completely emotionally unequipped for it? And yeah, the Primarchs don't seem to be emotionally equipped for much, so a lot of these Primarchs don't know each other very well. They might have quite big rivalries with the other ones, and sometimes the ones that we might look at, like Guilliman or Dawn, and think are the most logistically minded, the most grown up, the most sensible and stable, maybe they aren't the ones that many of the other Primarchs like. And if you're going to be the Warmaster, you have to be able to tell all the other Primarchs what to do. There are certainly Primarchs who seem a lot more emotionally stable, mature, adult, but they're not the Primarchs that got on the best with all their brothers. The skill of Horus, who was found first, who had been by the Emperor's side the longest, the skill of Horus was that almost all of the other Primarchs respected him. So when the Emperor decided he'd leave the Crusade, and the Crusade was finally in a position where he could go and work on other projects, he left Horus in charge, because Horus was the only one who could tell all the other Primarchs what to do and have a good chance they'd actually do it. No investment 9822. Why didn't the Emperor prepare for the heresy if he knew he was on such a short timeline? The thing is, he kind of did. We get this hinted at a few times that the Emperor and his main servant Malcador, who formulated a lot of the plans, they kind of expected there to be some sort of rebellion of the Primarchs, and maybe they were trying to foster a bit of division because they expected that at least some of the crazier ones would have to be gotten rid of. The Emperor and Malcador had done this before. Before the Space Marines, there was a different set of genetically engineered warriors called the Thunder Warriors, who were prone to berserk fits of rage. They were very useful for conquering Terra, but once Terra was conquered and they'd invented Space Marines, the Custodes massacred all the remaining Thunder Warriors because they were too dangerous to stay around. So there are hints that the Emperor and Malcador did expect at some point, once the Crusade was over, that some of the Space Marines might rebel, and maybe had put in place, or they felt they'd put in place, enough safeguards to make sure that that didn't destroy everything. That was almost going to be an inevitability. We know that 2 legions were lost. We don't know why they were lost. We know that other legions had to go and censure those legions, so we know this sort of thing does happen, but it seems that the scale of the heresy, and particularly the massive involvement of chaos, certainly the fact that Horus, the Primarch in charge, was the one corrupted, was something they didn't quite expect. It's not that the Emperor and Malcador didn't prepare for a rebellion, it's that the rebellion was on a scale much bigger than they'd prepared for, and it came alongside a load of other problems, like Magnus shattering the webway project, which meant that they were on the back foot from the very, very start. And following on from that, Horus was weak says, why didn't the Emperor tell Horus or the Primarchs about the webway and the webway project? The very short answer is, because he didn't trust them. The Emperor has made these things, these giant generals, with some warp power that he stole from Chaos, we think, and then instead of growing up under his control, they've been scattered to various human planets. They often believe different things to him. Some of them have emerged with actual mutations like angel wings that they may or may not have been intended to have, and many of them don't seem particularly happy with him as their father, I guess. So there's sort of a lack of trust between the Emperor and the Primarchs. The Custodes, the Emperor's other most trusted servants, notably say that the creation of the Primarchs and the Space Marines was a bad idea. They think it's a bad idea from the start. So the usual rule as to why the Emperor doesn't just tell the Primarchs everything, all of his plans, is that he doesn't fully trust them. They basically have one job, it's conquer real space, and then, we'll see how many are left after that. Specifically about the webway though, the Emperor has this overarching plan, it's kind of the other half of his plan, to gain access to the webway, which is a network of tunnels in reality that run in between the warp and real space. The webway is much safer than using the warp for space travel. At the point of the Great Crusade, the Eldar had been the main users of the webway. They didn't make it, but they were the main users of it. But the Eldar, just before, had been destroyed by the birth of Slaanesh. So the Emperor wanted to capitalize on that, invade the webway, take it over for humans, and use that to do human space travel, be much, much safer. And he keeps this plan a secret from the Primarchs, who, as we know, may or may not have been corrupted by Chaos, we're not sure. When some of the Primarchs find out independently about the webway, like Magnus the Red, who's the Primarch of the Thousand Suns, he finds out on his own about the webway. The Emperor says to him, yeah, I know already, but I've got a project going, and it's very delicate right now, so whatever you do, don't interfere. And yeah, that doesn't work out as planned. Silocat says, how did the traitor Primarchs plan to deal with the Custodes in the initial stages of the heresy? I think actually In the initial stages, they didn't plan to deal with them at all. The custodies are the Emperor's bodyguards. They're sort of around in the Imperium, but most of them are on Terra in the palace around the Emperor. Horus's plan broadly was the same plan he used on Crusade. Amass as much power as quickly as possible into one giant thrust and power their way towards Terra with an overwhelming force before all of the loyalist legions who are spread out across the galaxy could effectively get back to stop him. The intention would be that by the time the traitor forces got to Terra, there were just so many of them that they would overwhelm the Imperial Fists who were defending the walls, the Custodes who defended the palace, and the millions of regular soldiers who defended the planet. Astartes 1413 asks, how close were the traitors in winning the Horus Heresy? The answer is very close. By the point of the siege, Horus has done a number of pretty clever things. He's taken the three biggest loyalist legions, the Dark Angels, the Blood Angels, and the Ultramarines, and he'd already sent them on missions far, far away on the other side of the galaxy. He was the Warmaster, so he could do that. The only loyalist legions left were ones that were quite small by comparison. And then he dispatched the Word Bearers to raise a great warp storm called the Ruin Storm, which would effectively stop those three legions getting back in time. And then he took over loads of worlds, amassed his forces, and blasted his way pretty much to Terra within a few years. For the entire duration of the war, the loyalists are trying to delay the inevitable. They know Horus has more forces, and all they're trying to do is hold out long enough that one of those great big legions can get back through the storms to Terra. They fight a number of huge battles on Horus's path just to try and slow him down. And when it comes to the actual siege of the palace, and Rogel Dawn, who's in charge of the defense of Terra, knows that his only real plan is to make each wall last as long as possible, to delay the traitors as long as possible. There's no hope of beating them, just of delaying them until the reinforcements can get through. And eventually that is what happens, but by that point, Terra is ruined and barely anyone knows what side they're fighting on anymore. Hydra Phantoms asks, why didn't the traitors do a final push after Horus died when they're so close already? And that's to do with what the traitor forces were actually like by the end of the siege. One of the problems with the traitor forces is that they were formed of 9 different Primarchs who had different grievances with the Imperium, and by the end of the siege, 4 of them had fallen directly to the control of rival Chaos powers. And what that means is that while the siege starts relatively organized, as it goes on, and as these forces get separated and this grueling war continues, a lot of the cohesion in the traitor ranks starts to really break down. The Emperor's children quit the wars and go and do whatever they want in the civilian quarters of Terra. Perturabo, who's the person in charge of the siege, quits the entire thing when he realizes that winning by magic and demons wouldn't really prove anything about how good a general he is. Generally, by the point where Horus and the Emperor are fighting each other, the rest of the traitor forces are a series of crazed warbands roaming through the palace, killing whatever they can, and the loyalists are so broken down that they're not really any better. All strategy, all command, all attempt at fighting a unified war has gone, and a lot of the Marines are dead. They've just been whittled down. By the time Horus and the Emperor are fighting, the real threat to the loyalists is demons. The reality of Terra has been weakened so much that no one really knows where the palace or Horus's command ship or the warp start and end. People are walking through the palace and emerging hundreds of miles away because all of reality has started to be twisted. And the biggest threat is all these demons that have started to turn up within the palace. And of course, when the Emperor kills Horus, that link is severed, the Chaos Gods lose, and the demons start to disappear. By that point, the actual traitor legions, the renegade Astartes on the ground, are in no position to do another push. They barely get off Terra alive. Which leads into the next question. Sacred Ancestor asks, at the end of the siege, was Horus stronger than the Emperor? And the answer is yes, but because of the Emperor's choices. Near the end of the siege, the Emperor realizes the only way to stop this is that he personally is going to have to go up to Horus's battle barge and kill Horus, which is what Horus wants. They want this big duel where Horus is proven right. All the war until this point, the Emperor has had to stay on the Golden Throne because a few years before, right at the start of the war, his webway project was damaged to such a degree that only he could stop hordes of demons pouring in and invading the planet. So the Emperor hasn't really been able to participate in the war yet. But at the end of the siege, he finally goes, right, I'm going to have to get off my throne, go up to the battle barge, and try and defeat Horus. Initially, the first plan is that the Emperor tries to bring in loads of warp power into himself, which seems to be one of his big abilities. But this turns out to be a bit of a trick. We realize that if the Emperor does this, if the Emperor draws in all the power of the warp that he needs to defeat Horus, he will become this thing called the Dark King, which is a god, a fifth chaos god, or maybe something bigger than all of them that will ruin the galaxy. He'll lose all of his humanity and he'll become this primal force of ruin. That is how much warp power he needs to take in order to be stronger than Horus. And he's convinced that that will actually be a bad idea. So he gets rid of a load of that warp power and he decides that he will fight Horus as a very powerful psyker. He's still the Emperor, but Horus has the infinite power of the warp, and the Emperor decides not to have the infinite power of the warp. He goes into the fight knowing that, and he sort of uses trickery to actually kill Horus, and the result of that is the Emperor is mortally wounded in turn, and all of his plans become nothing, but at least he didn't become the Dark King. Basically, by the time of the duel, Horus has all the power of chaos, and the Emperor doesn't. But that is because the Emperor realized that taking on all that power would be a bad idea, even worse than what happens. Dimbledurf asks, what were the Xenos factions doing during the Horus Heresy? And the answer is not much. There were some Xenos who actively took an interest in the heresy. There's a Xenos organization called the Cabal who try and influence it, but they aren't really powerful enough to do anything. Not much comes from that. The Orcs have been shattered at Ullanor. All the really big Orc empires were destroyed. Now, Orcs will of course eventually come back, but at the point of the heresy, all the really big ones had just been broken. The Eldar were still reeling from their fall and the birth of Slanesh when all their homeworlds were destroyed, so they can't do much. The Tyranids haven't reached the galaxy yet. The Necrons haven't woken up yet, and the Tau haven't evolved into the Tau yet. So while there were alien factions all over the galaxy, the Great Crusade had just killed most of them, so they didn't have much to do in the heresy. Lord Admiral Spire asks, how many veterans of the Horus Heresy remain active in 40k? And that's an interesting question. On the loyalist side, not very many at all. The most famous one that everyone probably thinks of is a guy called Björn the Fell-Handed, who is a Space Wolves dreadnought. When he wasn't a dreadnought, when he was just a guy, he fought at the side of Liman Russ, his Primarch. He fought through the heresy. And he's one of the oldest remaining dreadnoughts. So he's one of the very few Space Marines that can actually remember that far back. He's only woken up for special occasions. There are also obviously some Primarchs on the loyalist side. We know that Gilliman's alive. He can remember the heresy. We know that the Lion is back, Lionel Johnson. He can remember the heresy. Also, there are a few that we think are still around. Corax is still about somewhere. Vulcan's still about somewhere. They can remember the heresy. So there are a few Primarchs, and then there are probably a few Custodians. The Adeptus Custodes, we don't know how long they live, but after the heresy, they went back into the palace and they became bodyguards until almost the 41st millennium. It's possible that a few of those actually remember the heresy. So on the loyalist side, it's probably quite a small number. On the traitor side, it's probably a lot more. After the siege, all the traitor forces were forced off of Terra and hounded by the loyalists into a region of space called the Eye of Terror. Terror O-R, not terror with an A at the end. They lived there for 10,000 years in the Eye of Terror, which eventually would become the Great Rift that we see in 40k now. The warp and real space crossover, so time doesn't work properly. They might have only experienced a few hundred or thousand years, while 10,000 years has passed outside. And a lot of the Chaos Space Marines that are still attacking the Imperium today, Chaos Space Marines like Abaddon the Despoiler, they remember the heresy. For them, it might have only been a couple of hundred years since they left Terra. So on the traitor side, quite a lot of Space Marines remember the Horus Heresy. I7986 says, did Alpharius do anything during the heresy that would point to him being loyal to the Imperium? And that's an interesting question. Alpharius and Omegon, his twin Primarch, are the Primarchs of the Alpha Legion. The Alpha Legion officially sided with Horus in the Horus Heresy and fought on the side of the traitors. But there are quite a lot of hints that they might have had some ulterior motive. And that ulterior motive might have been fighting on the side of the Emperor in disguise, or it might have been fighting for Horus, but limiting how bad it got, limiting how far Horus could go. We don't really know, because there were so many splits within the Alpha Legion, so many plans within plans within plans, some of which didn't survive the war. I mean, Alpharius didn't survive the war, that no one really knows what the intended goal was at the end. We know that the Alpha Legion certainly did some things that supported the loyalists. The Alpha Legion deliberately kept the White Scars out of the war because everyone thought they'd go on the side of Horus, and then let them back into the war by destroying their own stations. The Alpha Legion hid operatives on Terra during the siege with a load of code words that would point them towards supporting Horus or supporting the Emperor, and then we know that someone in that legion activated them with the code word that should support the Emperor, but we don't know who that was. It's impossible to say that Alpharius, the Primarch specifically, did anything that would point to him being loyal to the Imperium, but his legion did, and those orders had to come from somewhere. Was it true that Perturabo and the Iron Warriors carried the heresy for the traitors, or is it a meme? And the answer is a bit of both. I wouldn't say that they fully carried the entire heresy. There were definitely a lot of other legions who were big and strong and powerful and did a lot of the fighting. The Alpha Legion, if they were on the side of Horus, were everywhere. The Sons of Horus, the Death Guard, huge legions that did some of the biggest and most grueling campaigns. However, the Iron Warriors were a very big legion that were very efficient at prosecuting wars, and Perturabo was a bit of a mathematical genius. He was the one most relied upon to break down the fortresses on the way, and then he was kind of put in charge of the Siege of Terra. He saw this as his chance to prove that he was better than Rogel Dawn, whose job was to hold the fortress. So Perturabo did a lot of work in the Horus Heresy, as did the Iron Warriors. He was in charge of the siege, he prosecuted that siege, and he eventually left the siege when all the people who were meant to be doing his plans just decided to do whatever they wanted. So yes, it's definitely the case that Perturabo was instrumental to how far the traitors got. Without him, there wouldn't have been a great plan to besiege the Emperor's palace that anyone would have stood a chance of following. He's definitely very much up there in being very, very important, but it's wrong to say the Iron Warriors carried the whole war. There were definitely other legions that did just as big a part on the journey to Terra.
I never wanted this. I never wanted to unleash my legions.
There we go. A little look into the absurd complexity that is the Horus Heresy. Hopefully, that's made a few things clearer, or maybe it's just raised even more questions. But there are a good 70 novels about the Horus Heresy and a load of campaign books, so you're not short of story threads to follow up on. Anyway, if you'd like more videos like this, I have a couple more that I've done for IGN where we answer questions. And if you'd like to hear more about the general lore of the Horus Heresy or 40k, you can find my channel and my Instagram and other social media all linked in the thing below. See you later, heretics.